Daniel Pink has made a career of being first on several major business themes over the last 7 years, ever since publication of Free Agent Nation in May 2001. His theory then? More of us will be working for ourselves in the future. Well, it's now the future. So I'm going to ask him whether that came true. He also wrote A Whole New Mind about the move from the information age to the conceptual age. But Dan's new book may be his greatest leap yet, a manga-style graphic novel titled The Adventures of Johnny Bunko, the last career guide you'll ever need. For my not-so-Japanese media-savvy friends, what the Japanese call manga, we careless Americans call comic books. Dan, welcome to Mr. Media.
It's great to be on the program.
How are you?
I'm good.
We had some contact when Free Agent Nation came back. I don't remember why, but somehow I put myself on your mailing list, and I'm glad we finally get a chance to talk today.
Yeah, it's a good topic for a omnimedia program like yours.
Exactly. Perfect. Yeah, that's it. Omnimedia. So you've written a comic book for job seekers. I mean, WTF, Dan?
Well, I'll give you the business theory behind it, or the media theory behind it, and it's this: that if you think about career and job information today, people get especially young people, get their tactical information online. What keywords to put in a resume, what does this particular company do, that sort of really kind of down and dirty, nitty-gritty tactical information is available online for free. That's where people get that information. So a book that provides that kind of information is useless. I mean, the information starts to grow stale as soon as it's memorialized on a page, and then by the time it gets to a store, it's doubly stale. Plus, it's not searchable and it's not free. So, to my mind, it's like books, and particularly in the career field, can't provide that kind of information. It's useless. But I think books can do what Google cannot. That is, can provide strategic information, big picture information. So this book I've organized around the 6 broad lessons about successful, satisfying work that I wish I'd known 25 years ago. But I've done it in a way, in manga, that readers can read in literally less than an hour, in a fun, explosive, propulsive way where I think the lessons actually stick better than if they had been rendered entirely in prose.
So Dan, if you cannot read this book in under an hour, should you be looking for different type of career advice?
Maybe. But, I mean, I think the speed is really important here. And that's, I spent a couple of months last year in Japan studying manga. And one of the things to understand about manga in Japan versus comics in the U.S., they're two, I mean, as media, they're very, very different. Manga in Japan is more like television. It's that ubiquitous. Something like 22% of all printed material in Japan is in mangas, in comics. Because manga isn't just for kids, it's for everybody. And you can get all kinds of works, in this form. So if you want to read about the dangers of nationalism, you can get a manga book about that. If you want to know about how to manage your finances, you can get a manga on that. You want to know about how to manage your time, you can get a manga on that. And as popular as manga has become here in the United States, particularly, these Japanese comics, when I talk about manga, I'm talking about the Japanese style, the Japanese inflected comics, they're still mostly for people under 17. And so we're missing this whole way of using this medium here in the U.S., so I decided to do the first business book for Americans in manga. So it's a 160-page graphic novel career guide that tells a story. It tells a story of a guy named Johnny Bunko, and through Johnny's trials and tribulations, readers end up learning those 6 key, broad, strategic, ungoogleable lessons about satisfying, productive work.
For those who are looking at our webcast that accompanies this, we're using video today, and I'm holding up your book, showing several pages, showing the cover, just so they know what we're talking about. That's the sound of the press release falling out of the book.
If a press release falls out of a book and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound?
Well, oh no, gosh, I hope there's someone there besides you and me that heard that. So tell me, why did you go to Japan to study manga? I mean, you're a grown man. For God's sakes, you were a speechwriter to the Vice President of the United States.
Yeah,
What are you doing in Japan studying manga?
Well, I was fascinated about manga as a business and manga as an art form. And particularly, I began noticing here in the U.S. manga becoming more popular. So if you walk into a bookstore here in America, chances are the manga section is going to be larger than the science fiction section. It's going to be larger probably than it was a month ago. That this way of telling stories, of conveying information is becoming more popular here in the U.S. And I wanted to go to the origin to see how it actually worked, both as an art form, as a mode of communication, but also as a business. And so I had the great good fortune of getting a fellowship to go over there. So a grown man with a family dragged his wife and our three children to Japan so Dad could spend a few months studying comic books. And it's a fascinating experience. As a business proposition, what's interesting in media terms about manga is that all of Japan, not all, a significant portion of Japan's pop culture, and again, the biggest export in Japan right now is pop culture. It is games, it is figures, it is comics, it is animated movies, anime. All of those in some ways pivot around manga, around these comics. Most of the animated films start as comics. Many of the games start as comics. Many of the figures start as manga. Many of the television programs in Japan start as manga. That is, in many ways, Japanese pop culture is a manga industrial complex. That it's all built around these. All built.
I can't believe you said that.
Neither can I. So it's all built around this. All built around these comics, which again, I mean, to a Westerner, especially an American, comics in Japan are so different from their role here in the U.S. It really, as I said before, is more analogous to television. I mean, it's that ubiquitous. And so studying the business of it was fascinating. And then I had the great opportunity to talk to manga artists, manga critics, about how the art form itself worked. And what was interesting about that is that it is a very, even though it's maybe a half century old, 60 years old, it is a very, very contemporary form of expression because it combines word and image in this particularly explosive, propulsive way. And the essence of manga, as critics and artists told me, is speed. It's meant to be read and consumed quickly. And so it's this sort of gloriously efficient form of expression. And as a dedicated prose head, P-R-O-S-E head, someone whose previous books had old-style literary conventions like sentences and paragraphs, it was somewhat of a challenge to tell this story about Johnny Bunko and try to convey these ideas in this fundamentally different kind of medium.
Well, and I got to go back because as a former White House guy, I'm sure you do remember Eisenhower's parting words to the nation, which were "Beware the manga industrial complex."
Yes, he was. Mamie was particularly outraged about the deleterious effect of comics on the American psyche. So
let me take a breath for a second. Let me interrupt for 1 second. I want to give out our phone number. If anyone would like to call in, talk to Dan about the adventures of Johnny Bunko, about Free Agent Nation, or about A Whole New Mind, or maybe his time working for Al Gore. It'd probably be an interesting topic, too. Our number is 646-595-3135. How did you explain to your kids that you were going to Japan to study comics and manga?
Actually, for at that point, a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 4-year-old, it wasn't a hard sell.
That's what I figured, yeah.
So they were into it. And also, just again, if you think about just how media, our elder daughter was actually a manga fan, so she thought it was kind of cool. And the other two kids, they just had this great kind of adventure there. And again, in a world of this new world of media. I mean, our 10-year-old was blogging back to her class about her experience in Japan. So they were, the Pink children were also on the frontiers of new forms of expression there.
And what about Mrs. Pink? What did she think of that?
She was into it. It's like, rather, I mean, she knows that 14 years ago she married an insane, crazy man. So, and she's been able to endure that for a decade and a half. And so, we had a great, part of it was just had a great family adventure in Japan, because we got to travel around the country and see a lot of really interesting things. And it's, terrific just to expose kids and adults to not fundamentally, but, significantly different way of life.
And Dan, one of the things I was wondering is, so you studied manga, you were in Japan, I guess, for a year. The concept for Johnny Bunko, was that already in your mind at the time that you went to Japan, or was this something that you came up with to match the media, or
it had been germinating, and then going to Japan is basically proof of the concept. When you just see how widespread manga is there. So you go to a bookstore in Japan and literally, think about a major chain bookstore in the U.S. and imagine, a large Borders or Barnes & Noble or big chain bookstore in the U.S. and imagine, typically big floor that there would be. They're usually three, sometimes 2 or 3 floors. But imagine, half or 3/4 of one of those floors being these comic paperbacks. That's how big it is. And when you see the different ways that it's being used, it becomes, and for me, honestly, it became more surprising that no one else had done this yet than it was like, ooh, here's a crazy outlandish scheme. It'd be like, imagine if Japan was making movies, okay? Imagine we had the medium of film, and Japan was making films, but we here in the United States said films, motion pictures, on film, broadcast projected onto a screen, that is something only for people under 17. Meanwhile, you have this other country that says, oh, films can be documentaries, films can be romantic comedies, films can be dramas, films can be thrillers, using all these other kind of genres. And, you don't have to be a genius to come back and say, hey, maybe we should be using this medium for other sorts of expressions.
Oh, okay. Now, in fairness, though, we did take one of their great film heroes and make him into a comic book, Godzilla.
Oh, sure, right. No, right, and so that's part of this early instance of the international cross-pollination, and that's actually one of the really cool things about manga right now too, because as it's become popular in the United States, you have a lot of young Americans who are drawing manga, who are creating manga, but they're inflecting it with a certain American look. So the look of the book The Adventures of Johnny Bunko, the artist is an American guy. I actually looked for an artist in Japan and ran into some troubles. First of all, they would have to do it in English, so that presented a challenge. And then also in Japan, manga reads right to left rather than left to right. And so, if you go there and say, hi, you want to do a transnational collaboration by in a language that's not your own, drawing in the wrong direction for almost no money, you don't really get the superstars coming out. And so I went with an American manga artist named Rob Tenpis, who's just this insanely talented young American guy who lives in Wisconsin, graduate of the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. And, the look and feel of the way that he rendered the characters, they're recognizably manga, but they have a kind of American inflection, or even more important, a sort of inflection of Rob's own particular, idiosyncratic view of the world. And so, you have this kind of fusing of different national media storytelling modes, too, that's pretty interesting.
Will there be, or is there a Japanese version of Johnny Bunko?
There almost certainly will be. We're actually in those talks right now, and because the Japanese are. The amazing thing is, what cracks me up is that there's already 3 reviews of. The book's only been out for a couple of weeks. There are 3 reviews of the English language edition of Johnny Bunko on Amazon.co.jp. I can't read a word that they say, but there are already 3 reviews up there, and so they think it. So it will be coming out in Japanese. How you end up kind of tweaking it a little bit to appeal to that audience is a challenge, because in some ways, selling an American selling manga in Japanese in Japan is like a Japanese person saying, "Hey, I'm going to sell you a hamburger here in the United States."
What what were the basic concepts you were trying to get across in Johnny Bunko? I mean, you're trying, but before you answer that, I mean, my sense of it was that you were trying to give particularly American young people in the corporate environment, just a better sense of, how they could solve problems, that dark cloud over their head didn't seem to have to be there, and, that they don't all need a magic genie, although maybe it seems that way.
What I was trying to do, the other genesis of this was, not leaving aside the business and media theory, highfalutin that they are behind this, is, I had spent some time, talking to college students about my previous books, and inevitably when I talked to them, the conversation turned to career advice, and I realized that many of them were operating under the same false premises that I was operating under, 2+ decades ago when I graduated from college. Certain assumptions about how the world worked that were just flatly wrong. I'll give you one example of them from the book. I talked to a number of college students, and inevitably one of their questions, sort of the prelude to one of their questions goes something like this: Dan, I'm majoring in this, and when I graduate, I'm going to work here. I'm going to do that for 2 years, then I'm going to work here. After doing that for 2 years, I'm going to go to graduate school. Upon leaving graduate school, I'm going to work here. And, I just shake my head and say, guys, it doesn't work that way. And, I tell them the first lesson that Johnny learns in this book is that there is no plan. And that ends up being a source of both terror and relief for a lot of people when I told them that. And the idea behind that is that, you have all these people with these carefully architected plans. And, I just have a very pragmatic beef with that, because I think that they're useless. That doesn't mean that you should do things willy-nilly, as I've discovered over the years, but what it does mean is that you can make decisions for two kinds of reasons. You can make decisions, as Johnny learns, for instrumental reasons. That is, you make a decision because you think it's going to lead to something else. You can also make decisions for fundamental reasons. You make a decision because it's what you want to do next, because it's interesting, because it's fulfilling, because you might learn something, even though you don't know where it's going to lead. You have to, and the dirty little secret, is that instrumental reasons don't work. It's too complicated out there, and that the people who really flourish are the people who make decisions for fundamental reasons and live with a certain amount of ambiguity of not knowing where it's going to happen next. And I say this, you've probably seen this yourself as an interviewer. I say this as a journalist who has the good fortune of writing about work. If you talk to somebody who's doing something really interesting, someone who's doing work that matters, someone who is making a contribution, and you ask that person, how'd you get to be doing what you're doing? The interesting people, the people who are really doing something valuable, the people who are really making an impact, if you ask them that question, 99 times out of 100, they will say, oh, it's a long story. Because they weren't working off of a plan. They were making decisions for fundamental reasons and living with the ambiguity. Where did you grow up?
New Jersey.
New Jersey. So when you were growing up in New Jersey, did you have visions as a 19-year-old saying, someday I'm going to be Mr. Media?
I think, I knew from the time I was about 13 and started selling articles that I was going to be a writer of some sort. But I think I know what you're getting at. I was thinking, as you were talking about, college 20 years ago, I was thinking about college 25 years ago, and I was thinking about all the people as you reach your junior and senior year, that people start separating a little bit. And I remember noticing that there were people in certain career paths who were sure that they were guaranteed a job.
Oh, yeah.
Just because they had that degree, but they were guaranteed a job because they were going to be carried through this whole process. So, 6 months before they graduated, 8 months before they graduated, they knew who they'd be working for. They knew they'd be there for so many years. They'd be making, $X $1,000. And I was just amazed at that because, I knew I was just going to write, and I wasn't really, not even, I was part of that free agent nation before the term, and I never thought about, following a profession in that way. So these people who had it all figured out, it's just amazing. And then, when they get that first job, and it was easier then, I suspect, than it is now.
Yeah.
They get that first job, and then, things go badly and they don't know what to do.
It's exactly right. I mean, I graduated from college 22 years ago, and there were a lot of people several people I went to college with who majored in engineering, and the reason they majored in engineering, they were reasonably facile with math, and they didn't know what else to do. And they didn't have many of them didn't have any deep love of engineering. There are plenty of engineers out there who have a deep love of engineering, and they end up doing very well. And so, the PC had just come out, so you said, well, there are always going to be these IT jobs, it seems like, and then the Cold War will never go away, so the defense contractors will always have work for us. And, they get to be my age, they get to be their mid-40s, and suddenly the world has turned upside down. And, you have these IT jobs migrating to India. You have the Cold War over, so fewer of these jobs in defense contracting. And you have these people who made this purely instrumental decision to be engineers really in a world of hurt, wondering what to do with the rest of their life. And, again, if they were operating off of a plan, the rug got pulled out from under them, 5 years into their career. Mm. So I have no moral, just to be clear, I have no moral beef against instrumental reasoning. I just don't think it works. I think it's just way too complicated out there. And I also I think it's way too complicated for that to work. The other thing is I think you actually close off opportunities. There's a delusion that you're keeping your options open, but in many ways you're actually closing off opportunities because opportunities often emerge through this kind of this lens of ambiguity. And if you're not willing to live with a certain amount of ambiguity, I think you're going to lose out on a lot of opportunities. The most important thing is that, I say this as a parent as well as a self-proclaimed expert, that making decisions for fundamental reasons, 999 times out of 100, 999 times out of 1,000, if you make decisions for fundamental reasons, you're going to be okay.
And by the way, Dan, I want to make life a little easier for you going forward. When you leave this interview, I want you to be able to take something from it. So I think it's terrible that you have to call yourself a self-proclaimed expert. So I'm going to say it here. Dan Pink is an expert in this field, and you can always refer back to, this guy.
I can refer to myself as a Bob-proclaimed expert.
That's right. Because self-proclaimed, listen, you've got enough credentials. I don't think we have to let you get away with self-proclaimed anymore. You can say, some guy on the other end of the internet said,
phew, what a relief.
I'm an expert. Yeah.
What a relief. So,
I think you kind of mentioned, I gather this book was really intended to a younger audience than maybe the last two.
Yeah, mostly. It's real. I think that the sweet spot for this is actually even younger than I expected. I'm hearing from, I don't know if the parents know, but I'm hearing from, 11 and 12-year-olds via email who really grew on this story. So I'm thinking of it as kind of for, 16 to 30. Although I've heard from a lot of, people older than that who seem to like it. And a lot of them, I think, again, one of the roles of a writer in this kind of environment, in a world where everybody can talk back, is that I think that, a writer, especially a writer of books, can't position him or herself as this kind of Olympian force who sends down sacred texts, that the great unwashed absorb in an unchallenged way. I think that I would love that. That'd make my life a lot easier. But it doesn't quite work that way. And I think that one of the roles of books today, especially, is as conversation starters. That is, what I've seen in one of the really sort of the most kind of gratifying parts of the email that I've gotten so far, even in these early weeks, is someone saying, I read this book and then I gave it to my 2 teenage sons and then we talked about it, at dinner. And that I think books can serve as particularly short, fun, fast books can serve as a conversation starter, in some ways as the first word rather than the last word.
But I do want to add a cautionary note. If you're 11 or 12 years old and you're going to start an email correspondence with Dan Pink, get your parents' permission.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Dan's got kids. I got kids.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. The problem is that in our household, we have parental controls on the email, but my wife has never figured out how they work. So our 11-year-old is in charge of the parental controls.
Oh, see, we're in the same boat. See, my 11-year-old, my wife went to the trouble of learning the controls and put them in place, decided my 11-year-old daughter could only use, I think, Safari as a browser. Well, the problem was she couldn't access much of anything, and even just stuff she had to do for school was drawing her onto more and more stuff. So she kind of outsmarted us on all that stuff. But,
yeah. I agree with your guidance about kids ask your parents before you email somebody. Although as a parent, I think that it's much better to let kids not to try to close off too much and let kids, especially on the web, let kids figure it out. And I think that the skill of triangulating what's a credible source and what's not is a really important skill for these kids to learn.
Absolutely. Let me give out our phone number again, 646-595-3135 if you're listening to us or watching me on video live today, April 24th, 2008. You're welcome to give us a call in the time we have remaining. For a guy to take a year, a grown man, to take a year.
It wasn't a full year, Bob. It was just a few months.
Okay. So for a guy to take 6 days and go 6 months to go to Japan and study manga, I'm guessing you had to already have had, as an American, you must have had some fondness for comic books to begin with.
I did. I liked comics. I wasn't a hardcore comic fan as a kid. I wasn't the kid who was, collecting Superman or Batman and then, putting them in special sleeves and, in climate-controlled rooms or anything like that. But I was a fan of in some ways, kind of early incarnations of graphic novels. You probably remember the Ripley's Believe It or Not series.
Sure.
I don't know if it's still running in the comics pit. I used to read. I remember Saturday afternoons in growing up. One of the great joys of my childhood, no joke, was the certain part of the. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. A certain part of the Columbus Dispatch would be the Sunday Columbus Dispatch would be delivered on Saturday afternoons, and it was the Columbus Dispatch for a long time was an afternoon newspaper, and the Sunday paper, some of it would be delivered on Saturday afternoon. I remember, getting the colored comics and reading through all of those, whether it was the funny stuff like Peanuts or BC or Hagar the Horrible or the Prince Valiant or Steve Canyon, whose author was actually from Columbus, Ohio. I used to love those kinds of things. And then I also liked, as I mentioned, Ripley's Believe It or Not used to have a series of paperback books that were these kind of graphic Believe It or Not things, which I thought were really cool. And then there's another book that I read. I remember I loved it, and I've searched all over to try to find it. And if any of your listeners know what I'm talking about or know where to find it, I would love to hear from them. There was this really funny paperback. It really was a graphic novel, even though it didn't call itself that, called Superfan, about this kind of this fan who, through some kind of like magic potion, turns into like a great quarterback, and a great quarterback known as Y.A. Schmickel. And
I have that book.
Do you?
I have that book.
You know what I'm talking about?
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Superfan, and then there was a guy. The sportscaster was Hithard Kurzweil.
Yeah.
You have that. I can't believe it, Bob. You're like the only person. You're as much of a geek as I am. I have been looking for that online, and I used to love that. I used to think that was like the funniest thing that I'd ever encountered. In fact, in 6th grade, I don't mean to reminisce about the glorious days in the 1970s in Central Ohio, but in 6th grade, I actually wrote a play that was a sequel to that. Because I was so disappointed that it didn't, I wanted to know more. I ended up, doing an early incarnation of fan fiction because I wanted to know what happened to Superfan.
Oh, that's funny. See, well, no, this is good because this is a different interview than you probably do in Fast Company. You know what I'm saying, Dan?
Oh, I am not joking around. Except for my brother who's a year younger than I don't think anybody has ever even known what I was talking about when I mentioned Superfan.
I would ask you to go ahead and talk now for a few minutes, and I go grab the book, but I'm afraid something will happen to connect it, so I won't do it. I'm pretty sure I know where it is.
Wow, that's amazing. I have looked. I have done Google searches and so forth, and eBay searches to try to find it, and I've come up empty. It could be somewhere in my, the dusty recesses of my parents' house in Central Ohio.
Well, we'll see what we can work out when we're off the air.
Cool. I would love to read it again just to see how puerile it really is. But
yeah, that's a good word for it.
So anyway, I did have some. I obviously did have some interest, and as an adult, as a supposed adult, I actually like reading graphic novels too. I've read a lot of the more kind of serious, slightly more literary graphic novels, which I've really, really enjoyed. I mean, some of the best books that I've read really in the last 10 years have been things like Persepolis, which is a great, especially the first one, was a great graphic novel, or just a really brilliant, really truly brilliant story is a graphic novel called Fun Home, about a young woman growing up in Pennsylvania whose father runs a funeral home, and I won't spoil the twists and turns there, but complications ensue. And even something like, there's a really terrific book about, believe it or not, about North Korea called Pyongyang, which is a graphic novel about North Korea. And you know, those are really among the most, there's a stickiness to those books that I found really profound. I mean, first of all, they're enjoyable transporting reads, but they also stay with you for a lot longer. And they're the sorts of things that at least I inevitably want to talk about.
Well, one of the reasons I was interested in you back to Free Agent Nation, but with this book, I was interested, and somehow I managed to bring this up in every interview, and I got to stop doing it, but it really seems appropriate here. I wrote a biography of Will Eisner, the comics.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and his big thing, and this 20-year period of his life that is less well known, is when he was doing educational comics for the military and for corporations.
Interesting.
He did this thing called PS Magazine. In fact, last week we did a panel discussion about it on this medium. But his whole thing, and this goes back to the 40s when he was in the Army, was that he felt that comics would be a way that you could train soldiers, people who came from all different walks of life, especially at that time where you had guys who had indoor plumbing, guys who had not, people who could read, people who could not. But he felt that they could all get the same information from a comic, as opposed to, some people could read an Army manual and some people couldn't. So he devoted his life to comics that would teach you something. And when I finished reading Johnny Bunko, it made me think of that, because it's a completely different field, but you've really taken something that young people particularly really need to know and put it in a format that they'll pay attention to.
I hope so. I mean, it's great to. I did not realize that about Eisner. I mean, I read, and I'm spacing out on the exact name of them, but the stories of the early, really gorgeously dark tale of growing up in that tenement.
Contract with God.
Contract with God, right? I read that, but I mean, Eisner, as always, was ahead of his time, because now you have the World Bank, for instance, using it for development around the world, and I think it's a form of expression that we shouldn't think of as, we tend to think of it as either juvenile or as dumbing down, but it's just another form of expression. One of the things that I thought was awesome when I was talking about this book somewhere. I was talking about this book in Austin, Texas. And somebody came up to me and said, I'm a technical writer for software, and we're contemplating doing our support manuals and peripheral information in comic form. And my reaction was, oh my God, it's about time. Because imagine if those kinds of documents that come with your computer or your printer or other kinds of things were rendered in a form that you could actually comprehend. And it actually took the user's perspective. And so, Eisner, who was, obviously a genius, and anybody who even dares to do any kind of graphic novel or comic in America, it stands on his shoulders. I mean, he's ahead of his time in using it for these more wider-ranging purposes.
Well, Dan, I know from reading your website today that you're trying out some novel ideas that are attracting attention. So I want to find out, how did your first coffee Klatch at the Starbucks in Boston go this week? You know what?
It went pretty well. I was not sitting there by myself, fortunately. We had a quorum. It was actually pretty good, and it was kind of interesting. And I think that's one of the. I was in Boston anyway, and I'm going to do another one. I'm in Chicago right now. I'm going to do another one here in Chicago, actually just in a few hours. It's one of the ways that I think that in this kind of landscape, authors need to get their work out. And it is, the dirty little secret here is that there's a huge amount of self-interest behind it. Because when you talk to readers, they tell you really interesting things. They tell you what works. They tell you what doesn't work. They tell you what they're interested in. They tell you what they're working on, and you get this really great kind of conversation. And anybody who is willing to spend 45 minutes with me is probably someone who would then go out and talk about the book, especially since everyone who shows up gets these free Johnny Bunko chopsticks.
Well, and
chopsticks, just to be clear to your listeners, chopsticks play a central role in the narrative.
Exactly. That's what I say. I mean, they're magic.
There are magic chopsticks there, indeed.
Yeah, I did read the book, folks, and here, for those of you watching on video, I'm going to hold it up again. Let's see. I got to get used to this left-right thing. Okay, there we go. There's Johnny Bunko. There's the book right in front of the camera. So you had enough people show up. So this is what I'm wondering. As a guy who's done some book signings, you go into Starbucks. I just thought that was so funny. You go into Starbucks. I mean, do you have a sign up on your table or somewhere? Are you wearing a sign?
I did you know what I did? I got there 15 minutes early, and fortunately it was a nice day in Boston, and I got a seat outside, and I popped open my laptop, and on my laptop I rested a copy of Johnny Bunko. And strangely, I was the only person in the place displaying a copy of Johnny Bunko, and these dedicated readers immediately picked up on that subtle signal and said, "Hey, you must be Dan." So it was fine. I mean, it's very kind of informal. But I think in some ways, you think about that contrasting to a regular book signing. In some ways is more valuable because it's less of a monologue. It's much more of a dialogue. It lasts, a little bit less time, but it's actually, I think, a richer experience for people who show up. And since, I went to do a book talk at a store in Baltimore, and, we had, 8 people show up, which is, not great.
Welcome to my life.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's the experience of many authors, absolutely. Yeah. And so, I figure if you're gonna have 8 people show up, you might as well just, have some coffee and donuts and talk about things rather than, get a kind of formal monologue presentation.
Are you going to do these consistently at Starbucks, and then maybe hopefully they'll start carrying the book?
Oh my God, what a great scheme! Today, who knows? I mean, Starbucks are just so ubiquitous, which is a joke that I actually make in the book. Somewhere along the way, I actually spoke to Starbucks employees a couple of weeks ago, and they turned out for to hear about this, trying to hear about this stuff. Yeah, it'd be great. Although the one in Chicago is not at a Starbucks. It's at actually, believe it or not, an independently owned coffee place, one of the few remaining.
No, I choose not to believe that they exist.
We'll be doing it. I have no beef against Starbucks. I have no beef against anybody that gives me an hour's worth of real estate for the price of a cup of coffee.
Well, go ahead and tell us the name of the place you're going to be at in Chicago.
It's the Millennium Park Cafe. It's at 11 North Michigan Avenue. I actually have done. I did some reporting in Chicago a couple of years ago and did some interviews there, and I've actually on other trips to Chicago met friends there. It's a really nice place. It's obviously right across from Millennium Park.
I cannot possibly promise that we will get you anyone from this interview to that coffee shop, because the vast majority of our listens come archived and people download in the interview at their convenience. But you never know.
Well, you never know. And actually, if you come to this coffee Klatch in a few hours in Chicago and say, Mr. Media sent me, you get 2 free Johnny Bunko chopsticks.
Holy moly, guys! You got to turn out for this. Make me look good.
But I think you need to. I think one of the ways that you get the word out, absent, a spot on Oprah is really in this much more kind of conversational way. So we also did a movie trailer for the book, which has gotten some pretty good attention, and we're trying to develop a website that is much more kind of encourages reader participation by having contests and things like that. And so it really is, I've basically, it took me a while. You probably figured this out well before I did, that it is a conversation. It's not a monologue. And
right.
Writers like us get the first word, but we sure as heck don't get the last word. Nor should we.
No. Well, let's go back in time to Free Agent Nation. I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Where did the inspiration from that book, from where did it come?
Well, I mean, that came from my leaving a real job to go out on my own, and looking around and saying, wow, noticing that other people were doing it, and recognizing that we didn't really know much about this seemingly large group of people who had made this decision or been forced into this decision. And so just, following my curiosity, wanted to know more about it. So I ended up trying to do a census of Free Agent Nation by spending about a year with my wife, my beleaguered wife, and then our one child, traveling around the U.S., just interviewing a lot of people who had either leapt into Free Agent Nation or been pushed into it, just to try to get a sense of who these folks were, why they were doing what they were doing, how they were doing what they were doing, and what it meant for the economy, for other kinds of social institutions.
It's interesting because, like I said, as a guy who had been freelance writer, the original, free agent, I was aware at the time, particularly through the 90s, that there were more and more people who seemed to be working for themselves and taking it all on themselves, either because they, in my case, I make a lousy employee. I've had I've had two jobs in my life where I actually had to report, one lasted 6 months, one lasted 9 months. And I can say in all honesty that I am not the guy you want to hire and expect to come into work at 9 o'clock every day. I don't like to get up in the morning. What can I tell you?
Yeah.
But, it was interesting to me, though, that, no one had really captured that element of the whole American scene at that time. And you had a good title, and my recollection, correct me if I'm wrong here, if I overstate this, but it seemed to me that you networked the hell out of that book.
We did reasonably well. I mean, it helped describe, I think, in small part a particular moment, and it gave people some of the vocabulary to talk about it. And I like to think that it was credible because it was so, intensely reported and researched. I mean, I don't think anybody had ever gone into it in that kind of depth. Really just talking literally to hundreds of these people and really going through a lot of the research and talking about what it all meant.
What did you, as you look back on it, what did you get right in Free Agent Nation? What did you get wrong?
I think one of the things that I got, let's talk about the wrong. I mean, among the things that I got wrong were that it would have that these force of free agents would have an effect on politics. That has not proven itself correct at all. Much to my dismay, you still, you basically have, you still have, as it was when the book came out long ago, you have, people talking about big labor and big business when, in fact, most Americans have scant connection to either one. So that was dead wrong. I had a phrase that I thought was going to be, in my obituary, because it would be so enduringly part of the American vocabulary, which was e-tirement, and that went nowhere. I think, and what did I get right? I mean, I think what I got right was really central to the book is a set of animating values of these free agents, which I think have become the animating values of a big chunk of the workforce, and also the emergence of a kind of infrastructure to support them, whether it's Staples or Office Depot, or I had FedEx and Kinko's and Staples and Office Depot and a whole bunch of these other operations that I described as this kind of ad hoc free agent infrastructure. And actually, subsequently, FedEx and Kinko's began to merge for these kinds of reasons. And so I think that was mostly right. I guess the big surprise was the big surprise, or maybe the most lasting effect, is that is sort of strangely the effect on corporate America, that the emergence of these free agents has in some ways forced the hand of large employers or traditional employers, so that in order to get the people like you to work there, they have to actually treat you more like a free agent. That is, basically simulate the conditions outside simulate the conditions inside the organization of what it would be like to work outside the organization. And, and so that has an effect on how actually corporations and other organizations are constituted in a lot of their work practices. You see it you see it in something like what Best Buy corporate headquarters is doing, where they have a results-only work environment where you don't have to have a schedule. You just do what you do when you want to do it, which is kind of how you and I operate. Even though those people are getting
very little. Even though
those people are getting W-2s, they are employees both in spirit and under the law. But the way that Best Buy has chosen to get the most out of them is by basically treating them like free agents. And so I think that is it. The other thing is that it's become, probably for better, it's become far less exotic. That is, the idea of working at home used to be this kind of strange thing. People maybe kind of conceal it a little bit, and now it's just completely, there's nothing to it.
And then after Free Agent Nation, rather than writing a sequel, which I suspect you could have easily done, you went in a very different direction with your second book, A Whole New Mind. Can you tell us? I'm not as familiar with that as I am the first.
Yeah, that book is Free Agent Nation was about the sort of how people are working. This book, A Whole New Mind, makes an argument about what people are doing, and the central idea of the book is that the abilities that used to matter most were these kind of logical, linear, sequential, SAT spreadsheet, what we might think of as metaphorically left brain abilities. And today, those abilities still matter, but they matter less. And it's now these abilities that we think of as more right-brained, artistry, empathy, inventiveness, big-picture thinking. Those are now, for some very hard-headed reasons, the abilities that matter most. So this book lays out that argument and how the growing material well-being in the U.S., the offshoring of routine white-collar work to places like India, and the automation of certain kinds of routine white-collar work are putting a premium on these right-brain abilities. And then I talk about the 6 particular abilities, things like design and storytelling and what I call symphony, the 6 particular abilities that now matter most.
So six concepts in that book, 6 concepts.
Total coincidence. I will admit to being a Trinitarian in that things come in groups. I do believe things often come in groups of 3, or at least multiples of 3. But it's a total coincidence that it's 6 and 6.
Well, usually I mostly just think of dead celebrities in groups of 3s.
Sure.
Well, who has the most trouble moving from the information age to the conceptual age? Is it a generational thing? Is it a professional thing?
To some extent, it depends on who has the most to unlearn, and in some ways, who has the most, who's basically built a career on a lot of these left brain, entirely on these left brain abilities, who then suddenly realizes the rules have changed. It goes back in part to some of those engineers we talked about. It goes in part to, certain kinds of. If you think about, when we were growing up. You grew up in New Jersey. I grew up in Ohio. I grew up in Ohio when the Rust Belt is rusting, and so there's this notion in the air that, you can't get a job at a factory and expect to be there. That was basically, that way of life was waning, and if you were able to get a certain suite of white collar abilities, whether it's accounting or law or something like that, you were going to be fine. And we never really envisioned a world where computer programming could be done cheaper overseas. We never envisioned think about accounting, okay? Just think about personal accounting. At the corporate and auditing level, there's robust hiring for accountants right now because of Sarbanes-Oxley. But at the personal level, you have not this tax year, but the previous tax year, you had 1 million U.S. tax returns done in India because an Indian chartered accountant makes $500 a month. So there's no way an American accountant can compete with that. And at the same time, you had 21 million Americans do their taxes not through a human being, but through TurboTax. $29 piece of software, $29 download. And so people who sort of built their lives around these left brain kind of abilities and never really developed the other side of abilities might have a hard time transitioning. Although I think that everybody can kind of make this transition because these right brain abilities, I think, are part of what it means to be human, and all of us have them in some capacity. But the pragmatic message to young people and older people alike is that to make it today, you have to do work that's hard to outsource and hard to automate, and it also delivers on some of the new demands of a very abundant age. And the things that pass that test, hard to outsource, hard to automate, that deliver on the growing demand for meaning and style and design, ends up calling on a lot of these abilities like design, like storytelling, like empathy, that we often haven't taken seriously enough, especially here in the U.S.
Well, as we start to wrap up our time today, I feel it necessary to ask you about your White House time. You spent, and it's funny. I guess it's because I didn't. I was more focused on the books. It was only just as an afterthought that I actually looked at your bio today and saw, what, White House? So you spent 2 years writing speeches for former Vice President Al Gore from, I think it was 95 to 97.
That's right, yeah.
That's not a bad resume item for, a guy to, be out there with. Any special...
Yes and no. I mean, you'd be surprised. I mean, I've gotten email from people who said, and who knows, there are plenty of people I haven't heard of, but I get no joke, plenty, some email, less now, but more a few years ago, that say, I didn't buy your book because you work for Al Gore. But a friend gave it to me and I read it and I guess it's okay. So I'm not sure that any involvement in politics is necessarily a plus on anyone going out there to try to peddle ideas that to my mind have totally not political at all.
Now you left that position in 97, so yes. I mean this is totally off the wall. But I mean, would your life be any different today if that election in 2000 had gone differently?
Well, I mean, I think I'd be living in a better country. I think I'd be living in a country that wasn't entangled in a useless war. I think. Can you hear me?
Dan?
Yeah.
Hey, see, that's what happens when you make a negative remark about the current administration.
It's a Republican attack machine.
How do they do that?
Yeah, sorry about that. So I don't remember where I was, but basically, so I was a political speechwriter for a while. I liked working for Al Gore. He's actually a good guy, and but I would not have gone back to work in politics. I think I'd be happier as an American if he had been elected. But I certainly, would have continued to pursue the same non-plan for my professional life.
I understand, but what I was thinking too was that maybe that resume item would be that much more valuable.
Oh, well, yeah, that could be. It could be. It could be. It actually, these kind of things have, I'm a Washingtonian now, and there are plenty of people who dine out on a job they had for 18 months 30 years ago. I shudder to think about becoming that kind of person. And I left politics 11 years ago, and have not returned, and will not return.
Okay. Well, I was just kind of curious about that.
It was fun. I mean, it was a great opportunity. It was a really interesting, exhilarating kind of job, and as I said, really, really interesting and really, really fun. And every once in a while, you felt like you were actually making some kind of impact on the world. It's a sort of job where 6 months in that job is equivalent to 3 years in a regular job, because it's that sort of crushing and demanding. And as I said, I was privileged to work not only for the office, which is really what it's about in some sense, but also for the particular person who was inhabiting that office at the time, who I think is just a really dedicated public servant and a good guy.
Any memorable sound bites that you put in his mouth you want to take credit for here?
I would never take credit for anything. The code is that anything that people like, he came up with on his own, and anything that you didn't like is my fault.
I got it. All right. Well, so tell us what's next for you. Obviously, you're going to be meeting with people in Starbucks. And
I guess that's what's next, kind of in the short term. Yeah, I'm going to be having a little Johnny Bunko coffee Klatch a few blocks away from here on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. I am working on a book that, again, sort of a more traditional book with paragraphs and everything about the science, the science and economics.
Paragraphs and clauses. And
sentences that extend beyond 10 words, relatively a few pictures. It's a book about the science and economics of motivation, which is really interesting, sort of why people do what they do and how, in many ways, if you look at the research on this, we've really gotten it wrong. We tend to think that people are motivated only by carrots and sticks, when in fact those kinds of motivators actually work in a relatively narrow band of circumstances. And there are other kind of motivators, these intrinsic motivators, that end up being far more powerful that we have overlooked. So that's one thing. So I'm working on that. That's a real book. And then I'm contemplating. I should be knocking wood here if I could find some wood, but I have a lot of readers emailing me saying, when's the sequel? When's the next part of the series?
Right.
So I'll think about whether I've sort of closed off my options by calling it the Adventures of Johnny Bunko, the last career guide you'll ever need. But we'll see whether I think there could be more stories in these characters if the response continues to be. I'm knocking wood here. The response continues to be as good as it has been so far.
Very good. Well, Dan, I want to thank you so much for your time and for joining us on Mr. Media today.
It's been a pleasure, and thanks for hipping me to your Will Eisner biography. I'm going to look for it. I've always admired the guy. I think he's an American legend.
Wonderful. I appreciate that. And again, thanks for joining us. Good luck with the book and the tour.
All right. Thanks, Bob. Take care.
Right. Bye. And so you can find all of Dan's books, from Free Agent Nation to The Adventures of Johnny Bunko, available for sale on the Mr. Media site or Amazon.com. And check out Daniel Pink's own website at www.danpink.com. That's DANPINK.com. For dozens more celebrity and media newsmaker interviews, surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com, where you can listen to my earlier conversations with Billy Bob Thornton, Cheryl Hines, Milo Ventimiglia, David Fury, Anna Gunn, Bill Prady, Stephen Passes, and many others, or read full transcriptions. Please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, Blueberry, Zencast, or iTunes. And thanks for joining us today. Talk to you again real soon.